To begin with, cannibalism is absolutely legal in the United States, with the exception of the state of Idaho, the UK, much of Europe, Japan, etc. However, as Cornell Law School notes, a number of laws are in places across America that indirectly make it impossible to legally obtain and consume the body matter. The same can be said for the many other countries in which cannibalism isn't directly illegal. For example, in much of the world, desecrating a corpse is a crime. On top of this, in cases where the flesh is somehow obtained legally, a cannibal can be charged for crimes ranging from outraging public decency to preventing a lawful burial, giving the law a number of avenues to prosecute cannibals in this regard. But what about survival situations? The most famous example of this from a legal perspective is arguably that of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens. In this one, in 1884, 3 sailors called Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, and Ned Brooks and their cabin boy, Richard Parker, were lost at sea after a wave destroyed their ship. Cast adrift with only a few pounds of turnips for sustenance, Dudley and Stevens eventually made the grisly decision to kill and eat Parker. Brooks played no part in the murder, but would later admit to consuming Parker's flesh and drinking his blood to survive. Upon being rescued by a passing ship, Dudley and Stevens immediately confessed to killing Parker. The 2 men defended their decision by saying that Parker had become violently ill after consuming salt water and was at death's door anyway. Both sailors argued that killing Parker was morally justified to necessitate their own survival, citing the custom of the sea, which had seen many a maroon sailor drawing lots and eating one another to survive, generally with no consequences to themselves after the fact, so long as the lottery of who should be killed was deemed to have been fairly implemented. Thing is, though, nobody aboard had drawn lots. Stephen and Dudley even admitted that they'd held Parker down as they slit his throat to stop him from struggling. In this one, the British courts disagreed that killing Parker was necessary, as there was no way for the men to know that a ship wasn't about to crest the horizon and rescue them. They also noted the fact that they needed to physically restrain Parker seemingly meant he couldn't have been that close to death. On that note, a judge would later argue that to justify Parker's murder as a necessity, each man would have had to have been on the very precipice of death. Thus, the decision was made to try each man for murder, which was a capital offense at the time. Problem was that the public was largely on the side of Dudley and Stevens, and a jury seemed initially reluctant to condemn the men to death for doing something to survive in a desperate situation. As for Brooks, he wasn't convicted of any crime and was largely let off despite readily admitting to consuming Parker as well. The key distinction here was that he didn't take part in the actual murder in any way. As for the other 2, they were initially convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but in part due to public pressure, their sentences were later commuted to 6 months in prison. But the case did set a legal precedent that there is no defense of necessity for the crime of murder in cases like this, and it's now well established in law that killing of another human being to aid your own survival by consuming their flesh can never be justified in a legal sense. But again, eating an already dead person in the same type of situation is perfectly legal in most countries. Of course, the law is one thing, it's a whole different thing to wrestle with the moral aspect of the act. For example, there is the case of the now infamous Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crash of 1972, which saw survivors cutting and eating strips of flesh from dead passengers to survive. Despite initial religious reservation from most on board, every survivor eventually gave in to hunger, which speaks to the power of starvation has to test the very limits of a person's personal morality. As survivor Roberto Canessa later noted, our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. We had long since run out of the meager pickings we'd found on the plane, and there was no vegetation or animal life to be found. After just a few days, we were feeling the sensation of our own bodies consuming themselves just to remain alive. Before long, we would become too weak to recover from starvation. We knew the answer, but it was too terrible to contemplate. The bodies of our friends and teammates, preserved outside in the snow and ice, contained vital, life-giving protein that could help us survive. But could we do it? For a long time, we agonized. I went out in the snow and prayed to God for guidance. Without his consent, I felt I would be violating the memory of my friends, that I would be stealing their souls. We wondered whether we were going mad even to contemplate such a thing. Had we turned into brute savages, or was this the only sane thing to do? But to sum up, people who find themselves in an impossibly dire situation and resort to cannibalism of the dead are almost universally considered not guilty of any crime as far as the law in most countries is concerned. On top of that, even in non-survival situations, if you can manage to obtain the flesh of another human legally, you're likely also going to get off scot-free if you eat it, even publicly. This fact has been particularly beneficial in recent times with the fad of people eating the placenta after a woman gives birth, including at times when their partner or family members might partake, which most consider technically a form of cannibalism. Although where one draws the line with regards to when consuming a specific bit of another human's flesh is cannibalism or when it is not is hotly debated, and if you search around enough, you'll inevitably find many a wildly humorous, heated argument over whether swallowing human semen counts as cannibalism. Speaking of body parts, ever wonder if you can get amputated limbs or the like back from the hospital if you want your cut off bit? Well, check out our video on the subject here and find out.